be talking about something today that is going to seem sort of complicated. And I'm going to sort of preface this with there's going to be a different level of understanding between the adults in the room and our young people. And the truth is, you have an advantage over the adults in this room because this particular topic has been so mistaught. And there is so much misinformation floating around about the purpose and application of the Bill of Rights that there's going to be a lot of obstacles that our adults are going to have to jump over that you won't. Because the bottom line is this: understanding the purpose and the application, the practice, and the preservation of the Bill of Rights is not complicated. It's a very, very simple principle. But what happens is I'm sure you've already started learning, and if you've been here for more than, this is your second time, then you already know that our educational systems have been corrupted. You guys understand that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so a lot of the things that we are teaching in the schools simply are not so. And it's been this way for decades. How many of you here last year heard what I call the genealogy of the Constitution, the 700 years it took to write the Constitution, right? So I have taught that 700 years of history of the Constitution all across the country. And I have taught adults who have PhDs in American education, PhDs in American history and political science. I have taught Supreme Court justices on the state level, and each and every one of them told me to my face they learned more about American history in my 1-hour class than they did in their entire PhD program. Now that's not bragging on me, mind you. I think we should be deeply saddened by that. Because what we are teaching is changing the foundational principles about who we are. And so what we're going to do this morning, as quickly as I possibly can, is we're going to get into this program on what I call the Great Debate. And what we need to understand is there was a debate on whether we should have a Bill of Rights or not. Historically speaking, laying the background, we are about to enter into the convention to technically modify the Articles of Convention, which doesn't actually happen that way. It actually happens that we replace them. And we have some states that are not happy with the current direction of the new Constitution. It's interesting because the greatest opponent to the Constitution is the state of Virginia. And the state of Virginia is opposing this Constitution, our new Constitution, the one that we call the More Perfect Union, because they say it does not do enough to preserve religious liberty. Now, there's a great deal of background in here to understand what that really means, and I'll try to sum it up in this matter, because this is a matter of history that we do not teach, that we have cleansed out of our system, both in education and in our churches. Some of the greatest religious persecutions have been committed by Christians on American soil. We don't teach that, but it is true. Massachusetts had a law that said if any shipman were to bring a Quaker into the state of Massachusetts, the shipman would be immediately imprisoned and the Quaker would be hung. The original colonies established religion by law. It was a matter of law that you had to practice the religion of the charter. These were not friendly suggestions. Oh, welcome to our colony. Here's a brochure on church. We'd love to see you on Sunday. No. If you did not practice the religion of the charter, you would be arrested, thrown into prison. You'd be put into the stocks. You'd be tortured, beaten, tarred and feathered, which sounds kind of funny to us, but in reality, tarring and feathering is quite a horrible way to die, because you are covered in hot oil, and then your body is covered with filthy, disease-ridden feathers. So now your body is covered in second and third degree burns, and you're placing filthy feathers on top of open burned sores. And people don't die from tarring and feathering, they die from the infection and the sepsis that sets in from the tarring and feathering. And not only that, we're executing people. If you want to know a little bit more about this history, there's two people you need to know. One is Mary Dyer, D-Y-E-R. Mary Dyer was a Quaker in Massachusetts who was hung because she refused to turn away from her religious convictions. Obadiah Holmes was another man who was preaching based on his conscience, contrary to the laws of the colony, and was thrown into prison and beaten so severely that he had to spend an entire week on his hands and knees, sleeping, eating, doing everything on his hands and knees, because it was the only way he could be relieved of the pain from his whipping. Now, this is not Iraq, this is not China or Afghanistan or Syria, this is right here on our soil. And the people who would inhabit the state of Virginia are some of these people who were persecuted in the early American colonies. And the Virginians are saying, look, this Constitution does not do enough to prevent us from entering into a union that will impose upon us the very same persecutions that we're trying to avoid here in Virginia. The most powerful group in the state of Virginia was the Virginia Baptist General Convention, because it was the Baptists, specifically the Separatist Baptists, who were most persecuted, and along with the Quakers, but in the early American colonies. There were no real charters for them before the founding of Rhode Island. So no matter where you landed in the colonies, you were going to be persecuted if you were a Quaker or a Separatist or something like that. The leader of the Virginia Baptist General Convention is this man, John Leland. Now again, this is the time of the discussion of the ratification of the Constitution, our more perfect union. And John Leland, being the leader of the Virginia Baptist General Convention, makes this statement, that the current Constitution, they believe, does not do enough to protect religious liberty. Therefore, Virginia will not ratify. Now, this is a really, really big deal, because we already have states that are refusing to ratify the Constitution. And in order for the Constitution to be ratified and become the law of the land, we have to have 3/4 of the states to ratify. And without Virginia, they fail to meet that criteria. So, what does that mean? That means we have 13 independent states. We're going to be talking about what that means tomorrow, what it means to be an independent state, who have just declared independence from Great Britain, and they will not be able to come together to form a union for their common defense, for the general welfare, and to preserve the blessings of liberty. They will be left alone in their own borders to protect themselves from foreign invasion. Our battle with Great Britain did not end the first time around. How many of you have heard of the War of 1812? Okay? Our framers don't refer to it as the War of 1812. Our framers referred to that as the Second War for Independence. Because between the first one and the War of 1812, Great Britain never recognized our independence legally. Oh, you know, they signed the papers and everything, but they still kept acting like we were part of their colonies. So we had to go back to war to them to make the point, hey, we are not you anymore. Not only that, in order to achieve our independence from Great Britain, we had to have foreign help. We solicited the aid of France, Spain, and Holland. How many of you think that France, Spain, and Holland helped us get our independence from Great Britain just because they were a bunch of nice guys? No, they're looking to get something out of this. Here's the deal. Everybody wants a piece of this new world in the North American continent. Everybody does. And you have to know that by France, Spain, and Holland helping us, they're looking for us to help them get another piece of it. And so here's how this could go without a union. Hi, I'm the diplomat from France, and you must recognize that you now owe us a great debt. We have sent tons of money to help you gain your independence. Our people have sacrificed their lives to help you get your independence, and now you owe us big time. So here's what we'll do. You see that little land that you call Rhode Island? It's a very small place. Not a big deal for you. You have all this massive expanse to the west. You won't miss Rhode Island. So here's the deal. You give this land you call Rhode Island to the French, and we'll call it clear. No more money to us. Our debt is paid in full. How many of you think the people of Rhode Island are going to sign up for that one? No. Here's the problem. Without a union of the states, Rhode Island would be left alone to defend themselves from the French. And how do you think that's going to work out for the Rhode Island, people of Rhode Island? Not good. So the creation of the union was essential to preserve liberty so that the states could work together to shun off foreign invasion. Because we could be looking at France and saying, you know, we appreciate the sacrifices that you made. We greatly appreciate the money that you funneled our way. And we understand we owe you a debt. But look what we're doing. We're creating this union now. And all the states are going to work together to pay you off. And by the way, we're not going to trade Rhode Island on behalf of that. They're part of us. So what Virginia is saying is, and this is very key to understand, we are willing to forego all those protections. We are willing to stand on our own without your aid against all foreign invasion because we value religious liberty that greatly. Now, Leland had been a politician before, but he is, the Virginia Baptist General Convention now wants him to be a delegate on behalf of the state of Virginia to the Constitutional Convention. But guess what? Leland doesn't want that job. He feels that his call is still with the church to be a leadership of the General Convention. He doesn't want to be a politician anymore. So he makes a deal with one of his opponents to be delegate for the state of Virginia. And he goes to his opponent and he says, you want this job, I don't. But I'll make you a deal. If you promise to do everything humanly and superhumanly possible to secure greater protections for religious liberty, then I will back out of this political race and endorse you. You know that the General Convention is the political power in Virginia, which means I am guaranteed this position. But if I back out and endorse you, my people plus your people, you're a sure thing. But we will only do this if you will make this promise. Now I will say to you very, very boldly and assuredly that this handshake will change the world. Absolutely change the world. Because I'm pretty sure many of you have never heard of John Leland. But I'm also secure in the knowledge that most of you have heard of his opponent, James Madison. And the deal that Leland makes with Madison makes Madison the delegate on behalf of Virginia to the convention, which now we know Madison to be the father of the Constitution. And not only that, Madison is going to take his promise very, very seriously and ensure that there are greater protections of the Bill of Rights. Now look what has to happen here. The great trust that they're going to put in Madison, because before you can get to the Bill of Rights, you have to ratify the Constitution. And Madison's going to agree to ratify the Constitution, which gets rid of Virginia's greatest leverage. And they had to trust that Madison wouldn't turncoat on them and become a typical politician once the Constitution was ratified. They had to trust that he would keep his promise all the way to the end. And Madison does. And we get the Bill of Rights. Now, we have to get into the debate, because the debate helps us understand why we have a Bill of Rights. That is one of the biggest points of confusion in the application of the Bill of Rights today is why. See, we don't ask the right questions. How many of you have heard of a phrase called the incorporation doctrine? Okay, so the incorporation doctrine, I'm going to tell you what that means because you're going to hear this. And I want you to be prepared to respond to it. The incorporation doctrine is a debate on whether the Bill of Rights applies to the states or not. It is a completely erroneous argument because it's asking the wrong question. The question should not be, does the Bill of Rights apply to the states? Because the argument is it's part of the Constitution, which limits and defines the federal government, and therefore it does not apply to the states. And then we had to have the 14th Amendment that brought it in against the states. And so now we have this big convoluted mess on understanding everything because we don't ask the right questions. The question is not, does the Bill of Rights apply to the states? The first question we must ask and answer is, why did we even do a Bill of Rights? Because once you understand why we have a Bill of Rights, then you know the answer to whether it applies to the states or not. As a matter of fact, I will assert to you, by the time we get to the end, you'll understand that the question of whether it applies to the states or not is actually an irrelevant question, because of the why. And the debate tells us why we have the Bill of Rights. Now here's what we're going to do. We're going to have teams. We have the Richard Henry Lee team, and we have the Alexander Hamilton team. Okay? The Richard Henry Lee team says we must have a Bill of Rights. The Alexander Hamilton team says we don't need a Bill of Rights. It's unnecessary and it's dangerous. Now, just for your purposes, because I am a teacher and you are a student, you need to know all the facts, okay? I am very careful when I'm teaching to not insert my opinions into your lessons. I work very hard to do that because history has been infected by other people's opinions rather than sticking to facts. History is not a matter of opinion. It is not a matter of philosophy. It either happened or it didn't. They either said it or they didn't. So when I bring something in that may seem like an opinion, I'm going to warn you. And here's one of those places. We are going to start off with the Richard Henry Lee team. We must have a Bill of Rights. Now, the evidence for why we must have a Bill of Rights comes from a series of documents listed in the Anti-Federalist Papers called Letter from a Federal Farmer to the Republican. There's a whole numbered series of these. And here's where the opinion part comes in. We don't know who wrote those. There has to this day never been any evidentiary proof of who the author of those letters are. However, I agree with the historians who attribute these letters to Richard Henry Lee. That's why I attribute them to the Henry Lee team. Now, why do I do that? Because I have read things that Richard Henry Lee has written. I have read the letters from the Federal Farmer. Richard Henry Lee has a very distinct, snarky, biting sense of writing and humor. I mean, sharper than the sharpest sword. And you can't fake that. And you can't duplicate it. And those traits are found both in Richard Henry Lee's writings and in the Republican letters. So that's why I say that. Now, does this change anything about the proper application of the letters? No. It's just a matter of convenience by pointing to the author. So, we are going to learn from the Richard Henry Lee team on why we need a Bill of Rights. And this is Letter from the Federal Farmer to the Republican number 6. He says, the amendments recommended will tend to guard and direct the administration. Now, there's a different application of language here. When he is talking about amendments, he is not talking about the Bill of Rights. In his term amendments, he's talking about articles. The proposed articles in the Constitution, okay? He's saying, look, these articles, how many articles are in the Constitution?
7.
These 7 articles in the Constitution will tend to guard and direct the administration, but there will be a danger that the people, after the system shall be adopted, will become inattentive to amendments. What Richard Henry Lee is saying is, this Constitution is really, really the best thing that we have to limit government, but guess what? It's just a piece of paper with ink on it. And it will do nothing to secure your liberty unless the people enforce the provisions of the Constitution. Our framers called the Constitution a parchment barrier, which means it's just ink and paper. It actually does nothing to stop the evil and greedy ambitions of men. The only guard against government out of control is the vigilance and jealousy of the people. And Richard Henry Lee is saying, look, this paper is great. It is the best thing we have ever seen. But there is still a danger that the people will become distracted by their lives and society and no longer limit government. He says, their attention is now awake. The discussion of the subject which has already taken place has had a happy effect. It has called forth able advocates of liberty and tends to renew in the minds of people their true republican jealousy and vigilance, the strongest guard against the abuses of power. Now that word Republican there is not the party. It's a style of government. Republican government is government where laws are created through equal representation of the people. What is the strongest guard against government abuse of power? It says right there. Go ahead, shout it out, because I need to know you know this. The strongest guard against the abuses of government power are the jealousy and vigilance of the people. There's a man named John Philpott KrisAnne who said in 1790, it is the common fate of the indolent. Indolent means lazy. By the way, when you hear these big words, you need to write them down and learn them. I tell my son all the time, you don't need to use bad words. It's better to use big words. Because it's a whole lot more fun to insult somebody when they don't know what you're saying. So now you know indolent means lazy. Okay? So it is the common fate of the indolent to see their rights become prey to the active. The condition upon which God grants liberty to man is eternal vigilance. And if that condition is broken, servitude is his punishment and the immediate indication of his guilt. When we fail to every day, voting does not secure liberty. You are not doing your job and your duty to liberty or as a citizen by simply voting. If all you are doing is voting, you are failing in a constitutional republic. Because the preservation of liberty means that every single day you live putting liberty first. So, vigilance. Richard Henry Lee, continuing in our letter number 6, says, "Fortunate it is for the body of a people if they can continue attentive to their liberties long enough to erect for them a temple and constitutional barriers for their permanent security." What is the question we're asking about the Bill of Rights? Why? Why? Richard Henry Lee is telling us why we have a Bill of Rights. He's telling us they are a barrier. A barrier of what? How does this barrier work? He says, when they, the Bill of Rights, are well fixed between the powers of the rulers and the rights of the people, they, the Bill of Rights, become visible boundaries constantly seen by all, and any transgression of them is immediately discovered. Why? Because they're right here in front of your face, reminding you of what your rights are. We hold these truths to be that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. The single purpose for creating any government on this planet is to secure our rights. There is no other purpose for government. We don't have government so that we can feel safe. That is a phantom, that is an illusion. If your sole purpose of government is to feel safe, you will be enslaved. Because feeling safe is not something you can ever achieve. It's an illusion. The sole purpose of government is to secure our rights. And Richard Henry Lee is saying, if we can put this bill of our rights in front of the faces of the people so that they will see them all the time, there is no way they will forget what they are. See, that's the danger. The danger is over time, absent struggle, absent conflict, that the people will become pacified in prosperity. They will become lazy in luxury. They will become complacent and compliant in their comforts. And in that situation, people will relax their vigilance against government, and then government will assert power they're not supposed to have. That's happening right now. And the greater power government has, the less liberty the people have. It is a direct correlation and effect. And Richard Henry Lee is even telling us that. They become visible boundaries constantly seen by all, and any transgression of them is immediately discovered. They, what is they? The Bill of Rights, serve as sentinels for the people at all times. Why do we have the Bill of Rights? Right here. Richard Henry Lee tells us to be a sentinel for the people. So let's pause for a second. What is a sentinel?
A guard.
A guard. What is the job of the sentinel?
Protect.
Protect you, yeah.
To protect? How?
Like you being saved.
Stay alert.
So what was that?
Stay alert.
Stay alert. Now, is he just supposed to... You watch those commercials about the guy who's in the bank, and he's got the bank guard sign on, and the robber comes in, and the people in the bank, they look at him and say, "We're being robbed." He says, "Oh, I'm just a security monitor.
I just alert people.
I just alert people," right? Is that what we're talking about here, a sentinel? What is the duty of the sentinel?
Protect.
No. That's the duty of the people and their forces. The sentinel is just one guy.
Stay alert.
Say that again.
Stay alert.
He is to warn. When is he to warn? At what point does the sentinel cry alarm? When the enemy is pounding down the door? No, you are a very bad sentinel if you don't shout alarm until the enemy is on the door. You see, the sentinel is placed in a high tower so that he can see the enemy approaching from afar off. So the second he sees the enemy approaching from afar off, he cries out the alarm so that the people will have the opportunity to organize their defense for their protection. And that's what the Bill of Rights is. Why do we have it? To be an alarm. Not an alarm that goes off as legislation is writing the bill to limit your right to keep and bear arms. The purpose of the Bill of Rights is to make the people stand up in alarm at the mention of a politician talking about a common sense debate on gun legislation. Any politician that wants to discuss the legislation of your right to keep and bear arms is an enemy to your liberty. The very discussion of it is prohibited by the why of the Bill of Rights. Here's the problem. It was created to be an alarm. But the alarm has been going off for decades. And because we don't know why we have the Bill of Rights, it has turned into nothing but a silent alarm. Especially in those unavoidable intervals of inattention. Pacified in prosperity, lazy in luxury, complacent and compliant in our comfort. There are certain aspects of human nature that never ever change. How many of you guys know a guy named Solomon?
I know Alex.
You don't really know him though, right? You know of him. Solomon said there is nothing new under the sun, because human nature never changes. So now, do you see why the Richard Henry Lee team has a good argument on why we need a Bill of Rights?
Yeah.
Have we not fallen asleep at the wheel?
Yeah.
Haven't we become pacified in prosperity? Lazy in luxury, complacent and compliant in our comfort?
Yes.
So now we can all say the Richard Henry Lee team gets a point, right?
Yep.
Well, now let's hear the Alexander Hamilton team. Alexander Hamilton says the Bill of Rights are unnecessary and dangerous. Those are very bold words. And before you set aside the Hamilton team for those bold words, you need to know why he said them. Now, this argument is in Federalist Papers number 84. And Hamilton says this: they, the Bill of Rights, would contain various exceptions to power not granted, and on this very account would afford a culpable pretext to claim more than were granted. Okay? And this is an essential principle of understanding the Constitution itself. He says, for why declare that things shall not be done for which there is no power to do? The Constitution enumerates the delegated powers of the federal government. The Constitution establishes that if the federal government has not been delegated a power, it has no authority to use it. All powers not delegated to the federal government are what? Reserved where? To the states. So if it's not on the list of what they can do, it's a power reserved to the states. James Madison talks about this in Federalist 45. He says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And then he tells us the powers that have been delegated. He says they will be exercised principally on external objects, which is foreign affairs, and then he names them: war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. And what Hamilton is saying is, we only delegated a certain limited power to the federal government. So why do we have to tell them not to do something when we've never told them they could do it in the first place? He says it creates an absurdity. Look at what he says. Why, for instance, should it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which restrictions may be imposed? We never delegated any power to the federal government over press, so why do we have to tell them to leave it alone? It's absolutely within the Constitution that they can't touch it, because we didn't delegate it. He says, then if you make this liberty of press assertion, the government might urge with a semblance of reason that the Constitution ought not be charged with the absurdity of providing against the abuse of an authority which was not given, and that the provision against restraining the liberty of the press afforded clear implication that a power to prescribe proper regulations concerning we certainly wouldn't want to abridge on your rights. But we're looking at this list and we're noticing this thing over here is not on the list. And since this thing over here is not on the list, then it must be okay for us to regulate it. See, you never delegated the power for us to not do anything with it, but since you didn't put it on the list, you mean that you meant for us to have some power over it. Hamilton says you're undoing everything that we did in creating the limited nature of the federal government. He says not only that, they'll look at the list and say, oh, look at that liberty of press. You told us not to abridge it. We certainly wouldn't want to abridge your liberty of press. Certainly not. But we're having a problem here, because we're not quite sure what liberty of press means. And we might accidentally abridge it because we don't know what it means. So here's what we'll do for you. We will define liberty of press so we don't accidentally abridge it. And since we define this as press, right, because when they wrote the First Amendment, they had organized media, they had journalists, they had newspapers. So we know CNN, MSNBC, we know Fox News, we know NPR, we know those guys are press, right? But this over here, they didn't have this when they wrote the First Amendment. They didn't have internet. And since they didn't have internet when they wrote the First Amendment, then it must not be press, which means it's okay for us to regulate it. Your bloggers, your tweeters, Facebook posts, that's not protected by freedom of speech or press, because they didn't have that stuff back then. Hamilton says, what is the liberty of press? Who can give it any definition which would not leave the utmost latitude for evasion? You cannot define liberty without limiting it. And by making a list, you are limiting your liberty that has been given to you by God. He says not only is it dangerous, it's unnecessary. Remembering the 700 years of history, remember? 5 documents written over 700 years, beginning in 1014, and the first document being the 1100 Charter of Liberties, the second one being the Magna Carta of 1215, continuing with the Petition of Right of 1628, the Grand Remonstrance of 1641, and the English Bill of Rights. Hamilton's saying, look, if you make a list now, it'll have to be a short list. You're not going to be able to list them all. And we don't need to make a new list because we've been listing them for 700 years. He says we don't need to make a new list because all of these charters in which we listed our rights are incorporated within our current Constitution. Our British history created our Constitution. And Hamilton's saying, look, these documents are incorporated into the meaning and application of our Constitution as a matter of law. You don't need to make a new list because it's right there for 700 years. So now, how many of you think that Hamilton seems to have a really good argument as well? Right?
Yeah.
So how do you choose? Well, you don't have to. Because Madison made a promise, remember? To the people of Virginia that we would have the Bill of Rights, so he feels impressed upon himself to make sure that this happens. Madison said it has also been objected against a Bill of Rights. And then he goes and repeats Hamilton's argument and says, this is one of the most plausible arguments I have ever heard urged against the admission of a Bill of Rights into this system. He says, but I conceive that it may be guarded against. I have attempted it, as gentlemen may see, by turning to the last clause of the 4th resolution. Madison has written a text to be admitted into the Bill of Rights to make sure that the government doesn't use the Bill of Rights to take our rights away. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be used to deny or disparage not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Problem is, if you say that to somebody, they have no idea what you're talking about. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage the rights of the people. This fourth resolution was incorporated into the Constitution through the Bill of Rights, and it's the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment is the most important text in the entire Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I guarantee you, most of your friends, family members, and teachers have no idea what it even says or means. It is the 9th Amendment that makes us a republic and not a kingdom, because it declares that all the rights in the universe belong to the people, whether they're written down or not. If they're written down, you can't construe them. If they're not written down, you can't deny them, because they are still retained by us. The 10th Amendment works together with the 9th Amendment to secure the rights of the people through the power of the states. Madison says that these rights will be secured by the courts because of the matters of contract law. And I'll explain that to you in further detail tomorrow. He will say that the greatest guardians of our rights are our state legislators and local government. That's also what we're going to be talking about tonight, or tomorrow. What is the greatest guard of your liberty? The 10th Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. Why or to the people? Because there's a hierarchy in government. The states were created by the people through the authority of God. The states created the federal government, which means the power plan goes like this: people, states, federal government. And when the states become tyrannical, it is the right of the people to what? Alter or abolish. So there's the answer to your question. Does the Bill of Rights apply to the states or not? It doesn't matter. Because the rights that we have are not given to us by documents. The rights that we have are not ours because some men say they are. Our rights are inalienable as a matter of natural law and creation. And the Declaration of Independence says, when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, our rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish. So whether the Bill of Rights applies to the states or not is irrelevant, because the states are still bound by natural law. And the state has no more authority to take your freedom of speech, your liberty of press, your right to peaceably assemble, which is not throwing Molotov cocktails at officers, your right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, your right to keep and bear arms, your right to due process. These are all rights that secure your life, your liberty, your property, and your right to self-preservation, and no government has the authority to take that from you, whether it be the federal government, the states, or a homeowners association, because they are your natural rights. The purpose of the Bill of Rights is not a limit on federal power. The federal power was already limited in the original Constitution. If it's not delegated, you can't do it. But the purpose of the Bill of Rights is to remind the people to preserve their inalienable rights by keeping the government from redefining them. Asking the right questions will always get you the right answers. And knowing the right answers will always get you to the proper solutions. So, here you go. I am on Facebook, by the way. I have a radio show. You can download my mobile app and listen to my radio shows for free. I have a television show now that airs globally on the Christian Television Network. You can go to my website and find out how to watch that. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. So if you were following me on Facebook, you will see that I did a video here yesterday. And I'm proud to tell Mr. Hal, is he here? Well, make sure you tell Hal that we are up to almost 55,000 people seeing that video in less than 24 hours. So, let's change the way we do things. Let's stop repeating the wrong questions and start asking the right ones. Let's take back the narrative and speak truth. Thank you guys. God bless.